I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Lee Wind, the author of a book that I raced through in one sitting yesterday. His book, A Different Kind of Brave, is where you described it on a previous podcast I've listened to, Lee, as a gay teen love letter to James Bond movies. Is that still the most accurate description?
Yeah, that's sort of like my personal shorthand for it. I also like that it's a gay teen globe-trotting high stakes adventure with the heroic courage of the James Bond movies and the queer group of friends and ongoing romance of Heartstopper. So that's my
That's the more
more
expanded
the
version.
expanded bit. Right, one's the escalator pitch and one's the elevator pitch.
That's I've never heard that before, an escalator pitch. So yeah, I love that. So I as it's probably evident, I don't always read a book in a day, especially one. It's not actually for a young adult book or let's say I always feel a bit sensitive about pigeonholing books as children's books and young adult and that kind of thing, because a good book is, as W.H. Jordan said, there's no such thing as well, he said that you shouldn't basically write off a book just because it's written for a particular audience.
I like
So,
Ursula Le Guin's quote, who said that
oh
if
yeah,
you want to write a book, but it's too hard for adults, then you write it for children. Uh, but yeah, I
that's a
mean,
good
it's
quote.
basically for readers 13 and up.
Okay.
So I think that, I have nonfiction books that I write as well that are really for 11 and up, but
Mm,
because there's a lot of there's you can't have a hero unless they're overcoming something. And my
hmm
book has two heroes that they have to overcome something.
hmm
So some of the obstacles are, I think, a little hard for younger
hmm
kids, but definitely teenagers
Yeah.
and up. And I know that I have a lot of adult readers, and it's
hmm
kind of a thrill to hear that you read it in one sitting because that was the goal. That was like I was the kid that was, stayed up late at night reading books with a flashlight
Same
because
here.
the lights had to be off. So to have written something that makes somebody want to read it in one sitting, yay, joy. That's author joy right there. Thank
No,
you.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad because I'll be honest, I wouldn't have actually read this book unless you'd reached out to tell me about it and then very kindly sent me a copy of it. It wasn't on my radar, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this with you is to get it on more people's radars because I think it'd be such a shame. I think you reached out because you'd read something that I'd written about the film Casino Royale. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, that you're sort of like, your queer analysis of it. And I was like so excited. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to reach out to you and let you know that I like in a very similar way, like I love Bond movies. I want to make an homage to them, but I
Mm-hmm.
also want to do a critique of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like you're on this parallel path to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm doing it in the world of fiction and you're doing it in the world of
Yeah.
nonfiction, which is really cool. So I was like, I have to reach out to David.
That's exactly the feeling I had about it as well. As soon as I started reading, I thought, oh my God, someone has actually finally got around to doing the sort of books that I would have absolutely devoured as when I was a teenager. And in fact, I think the same sentiment you've expressed on the back of the book as well and elsewhere. So in your bio, it says Lee Wind writes the books that would have changed his life as a young gay Jewish kid, which I thought was, when I read that, I was like, oh, wow, okay. I mean, I'm not Jewish, but I am gay. And if I'd had this sort of book, which provided a alternative, it's an action-packed adventure story where the protagonist not just happened to be gay, that's really important to the story, but you've got gay kids doing really exciting adventures. And those sorts of books just didn't exist when I was a kid. So we'll get into why it was so important for you to do that, I suppose. But let's talk about you and James Bond first of all, because I'll be honest, when this originally arrived in the post, I thought, okay, it's going to be kind of superficially about James Bond. There's going to be the odd reference and that kind of thing. And then I got not very far into the book whatsoever. And there's this extent, I'm not going to spoil the story too much, but one of the main characters is dumped essentially. He is shunned by a really hot swimmer from school, and I'd love to say we've all been there, but I wasn't gay in high school, so didn't have that experience for better or worse. But he's dumped by a really hot swimmer who gives off Daniel Craig vibes. But then what the main character does, Sam, is he relates it to On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Bond getting his heart broken. And not just in a kind of that way, but then you also go into, because he's obviously, beating himself up and not feeling very good. He then kind of picks holes in the Bond movie and the plot holes. Why didn't Blofeld do this and that kind of thing? And I thought, this has been written by someone who really, really knows their Bond. So it was almost like about 20 pages in, I was like, this book feels like it's been written for gay teenage David. It would be the idea. It would be my favorite if I was, it's a great book as an adult, but if I'd read this when I was 15, 16, 17, it would have been probably would still be to this day my favorite book of all time. So where does your Bond fandom come from?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much. I always loved the action, the chase scenes, the gadgets. I just I remember, my dad was a really big Bond fan, and my dad had a very my parents were immigrants. They came to America from Israel before I was born, and so we were, I was first generation. Grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia that wasn't particularly uh, friendly about queerness, about gay people. There was like one gay couple in the neighborhood, and every time we drove by their house on one of the roads, like there would be some disparaging comment made, and it was a very unfriendly, unsafe environment to be openly gay. But I knew I was gay around age 11. But my dad watched the movies, and so I would watch them with him. I mean, more on TV, like before streaming, when you just had to sort of like, happen upon them. And it was something we kind of could bond about. That's funny, bond. But like it was something we could share, that we both really liked it. I mean, I didn't particularly like the womenizing. I like, I had no interest in Ursula Andress coming out of the water in her, skimpy bikini, singing, a sing-song thing, holding a conch shell. But everything else about the movies I really, really loved. So it was this like rare moment where we could share time together doing something that we both really enjoyed. And I think that was part of it. And then, the when Casino Royale with Daniel Craig came out, that was like a turning point for me, because that scene where he comes out of the water in his little square swim trunks, and it is such a reference back to Dr. No, to Ursula Andress coming out of this, the sapphire blue waters. And yet here, it wasn't a woman's body that was on display for the pleasure of the viewers. It was Daniel Craig. It was Bond's body. And I was like, oh my gosh, if I had seen this scene when I was 11 years old or 13 years old, and then that just got me spinning. And I was like, because I actually thought that was one of the best Bond movies ever. I loved Casino Royale. I like that parkour scene.
It's my favorite.
About 15 minutes in, like I was like, yes, everything, yes. And like the whole thing, like stop touching your ear, stop touching your ear. Like it was just, for the first time, Bond was not just a handsome guy. He was like, Bond was sexy to me as a gay man. And I don't particularly find, straight guys sexy, but like in this case, Daniel, I was like, wow.
We can make exceptions. We're a broad church.
I suppose. But like even just on the fantasy level, right? Like I was like, wow. And what would it look like? What would a gay teen action adventure where it wasn't, the gay characters weren't the butt of the joke, or, like it was like we got invited in a sense with Casino Royale. And that scene, and then I just sort of was like, what would I be able to write? What could I send back in time? If I had a time machine, I would totally send this back to my teenage self. So it's like, I don't. So how can I pay it forward? And then I really love Bond films, but they're so amazingly problematic. Like just like And just for this book, I was really focused on like this idea of masculinity and
Mhm.
what it is to be a man. And actually that scene at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service where, Tracy's been killed and he weeps. And really that was the end of Lazenby's career as Bond.
Mhm.
And it was because of, I think it was because of that moment of sort of emotional like weakness. Although like if you don't cry when your newly married
Mhm.
spouse is murdered in front of you, you're kind of a horrible person,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
it wasn't a bad thing that he cried, but it was like, as I say in the Sam's journal entry in the book, like, it's like the world couldn't accept that Bond would have emotions, that he could
Mhm.
sob, right? Like we want our action heroes to be this like two-dimensional thing. And there are moments where I think Daniel Craig, more than any of the other Bond actors, lets us see that this is a three-dimensional human being that is really flawed and has emotions. And, you know, I think that's one of the reasons it's so successful. So I wanted to create a character that like idolized Bond, but then slowly gets the sense that like, wait, maybe this shouldn't be my role model. Like
Mhm.
this guy is kind of a mess. And there's even a moment later in the plot when Sam tries to manipulate someone because that guy finds him attractive. And then he has all this guilt about it. And this is what Bond does. This is, like absolute textbook Bond, that Bond seduces Bond girls, right? To get them to help him in his overall mission. And flipping it around, that with Sam trying to do that, and then the guilt of that felt really exciting and
Mhm.
worthwhile exploring. So it's like there's this external journey where they have this adventure and they have to go back and save all the kids that are trapped in this gay reprogramming institute. But there's also this sort of internal journey of, them meeting and falling in love, and Sam really kind of growing up a little bit and
Mhm.
realizing that like just because there's this hero on the screen doesn't mean that that person is heroic in everything they do. And I'm hoping that it will be a series and that I can explore
Mhm.
some of the other Bond kind of like tropes of not just
Mhm.
masculinity, but also about like violence being the answer to every problem, which I think is really problematic.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, I'm excited to see where we might take it. But for now, it's one book, and I'm really just so thrilled that it's finally getting out to readers.
It's interesting what you say about the problematic elements of Bond. I never shy away from dealing with those when I write about the Bond films, but I think sometimes people just latch onto the problematic elements as a stick to beat the Bond films with. Whereas actually, it's far more. You can love something that you also find problematic, and some people can't seem to. My favorite novel of all time that I did read when I was like 14 years old is 1984 by George Orwell, and the idea that you can hold two double think, you can hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. I both love James Bond and also I don't shy away from addressing the problematic elements of it. Which you could probably say a lot of people's favorite stories have those problematic elements as well. So we shouldn't shy away from them, but it shouldn't stop us enjoying them at the same time. And what I really loved, so there's again, I don't want to give too much away. I want people to just read this book and enjoy it firsthand themselves. But there's a part, there's like a, so Sam, one of the two protagonists, he's been asked to do a daily journal, hasn't he, and write one good thing down. And that's a way of getting some interiority, which we don't often get with Bond, actually going inside his head. Um, but he reflects, he reflects on something, he reflects on things going on in his own life and then tries to process them using references from James Bond. And that's when he starts writing about Pussy Galore and the obvious, the whole plot hinging on Bond's. I'm going to say it because it's there right in your book, and lots of academic discourse. James Bond's magical penis, which I almost whooped when I saw that appear for the first time, because that becomes a major thread through the book. That magical penis energy that James Bond has, and believe me, there are a lot of academic journal articles written about James Bond's magical penis. Probably far too many at this point, and I've added to the discourse on that one. But it is an important part of the character. But I really love the fact that the character was sort of almost trying to make sense of his emotions by reflecting everything into James Bond. I'll admit that's the part of the book which I really related to, because probably I am, I've said this a few times on this podcast with various people. I am almost like dangerously obsessed with James Bond. I recognize the problematic elements, but I can't help relate pretty much everything in daily life to James Bond. And that's what I loved about that character, because he does the same thing that I do. But at the same time, he's so I hate it when I read young adult fiction and the characters seem far too grown up, because I thought you absolutely nailed it in terms of these characters being the ages they are, because they have taken steps into an adult world. Sex exists in this world, very Heartstopper like. It's interesting you made that comparison yourself. That's where you were sort of pitching it. Sex does exist. Teenagers do have sex with each other, and I kind of get annoyed when books just shy away from the reality there. But also, he's really, particularly Sam, he's not being forced to grow up as quickly as Nico, the other protagonist. So his version of relationships, like him feeling guilty about possibly having to pretend to seduce somebody else, as James Bond would just do it. That's very kind of immature of him in a way. And also the thing with his whole parents relationship, I just wanted to shake him, to be perfectly honest, with his parents relationship. But by the end, he's starting to sort of twig what might really be going on, and they might actually be happier than he thinks they are. So he's sort of on that cusp of adulthood, isn't he? But he's not too, so the sorts of programs that were on TV when I was growing up in the 90s and noughties, where the teenagers sounded like they'd had 35 years of life experience. Your characters don't sound like that. They sound quite recognizably like a lot of the young people that I work with in my day job in education. So I thought that was really, really impressive.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah. And there's also this sort of like ridiculous thing that like so many TV shows, the teenagers are being played by people in their mid or late 20s, right? Like they have perfect skin and they're like incredibly muscular and they've gotten everything figured out. And it's like, wait a minute, that wasn't my teenage years. We were hot messes. So I think that's
they're
what's
still hot
exciting, right?
messes. I mean, Sam is a hot mess, emotionally speaking, and he's so immature in so many ways. But it's also that wish fulfillment of the Bond lifestyle, because let's be honest, he's mega rich. His family are not hard up. And that might make the character quite unsympathetic, but actually he's still sympathetic, even though he gets to drive a Lamborghini around New York City, even though he's got the Amiga Seamaster watch that I still own, and I've owned for half of my lifetime, taking very good care of. But he's got the Sunspell polo shirt, which again I eventually bought myself when I could afford it, and all those accoutrements of James Bond, the lifestyle stuff, which, to be honest, I've always thought there's a lot of James Bond lifestyle blogs and YouTube videos and things like that. That's always struck me as something quite gay about James Bond. It is all those lifestyle trappings, which I know is horrendously stereotypical of gay people, but it is that kind of disposable income used on that because you're not spending it on your family angle and all that. So I mean, it's total wish fulfillment for teenagers, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and the Bond films kind of I was reading something recently and they were talking about how like the travel, the international travel, the going to all these exotic places. It was sort of some of it was before people could travel so easily. And so it was like it was that wish fulfillment too. Like, oh, what would it be like to, go to the Swiss Alps and, ski down the mountain, or, and in this case, like, what would it be like to be at Machu Picchu in Peru? That's one of the places that we go in this book. And I think that that's really fun and it's aspirational. And yet at the same time, putting on what the reader gets is that just wearing the fancy suit and wearing all the sort of like, the cufflinks, and that doesn't magically make you have magical penis swagger, right? Like it's the external trappings of Bond, sure, but what's going on internally. And that's why it was so important to have those journal entries, so we get to see inside Sam. And then the challenge for me was figuring out, well, what's the internal access to Nico? Because Nico is not somebody that's going to like write a journal. He's way more sort of like action oriented in terms of like he's in crisis. The book starts with him escaping this gay reprogramming institute, and
Mm,
then sort of his guilt is really um, weighing on him in terms of like he left behind like a friend that helped him escape, and not just her, but like all the other teens that are trapped there, he feels responsible for, and and yet he has to keep himself safe. So
mm,
that sort of there's a sort of recurring motif of him sort of having these sort of nightmares slash flashbacks, and that was I was really happy to come with that device
mm,
because it was able to, again, you can't really be a hero unless there's something you're overcoming. But I didn't want to re-traumatize. I didn't want to
mm, mm,
traumatize readers and have them have to, an early version of the book. We
mm,
actually started with
mm,
Nico being kidnapped and taken to this institute, and then we were with him for like a
mm.
week before he manages to escape. And it felt too heavy, it felt
Yeah.
too difficult, it felt like I was traumatizing readers, and
Mm,
that was the last thing I want to do. I want this
mm,
book to be a
mm.
celebration of queer joy. So it was like starting with the escape scene felt so right because it was so Bond like. It was like Bond movies
Yeah.
always start with the biggest big
In media
action
res.
sequence.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In the middle of the action.
Mm,
But how do you care about somebody, right? Like just somebody jumping out of a plane in a parachute, it's without a parachute. Like, okay, we're worried for them, but we don't care about them. And if we don't
mhm,
care about them, what do
mhm.
we care if they slam into the earth? So that was really interesting too. Like, how could I make it that we cared about him enough to actually be rooting for him to get out? So yeah, it was really fun working on it. And in fact, one of the editors that worked on the book with me, he had edited like the James Bond encyclopedia. So it was great to have somebody that really knew their Bond stuff
Mm,
to a level I don't even, have. And they were able to like, really make sure that we were right about all the details. I'm pretty careful. I try to make sure that I have like all those like crazy details, like in Goldfinger, that the bomb stops on 007
seven.
as a
Yeah.
wink to the viewer, and But that was really fun too to work with. Devin is the name of the editor that loves Bond as much as I think we do.
Yeah. Actually, I've got a really specific, really nerdy question. And you'll probably say it's just coincidence. But was the name of Sam's ex a reference to anything? Kevin.
Uh, Yeah, it was not a reference to anything. It just
Okay.
sort of
Well,
felt
it
right. But
worked.
was it subconsciously? Was it subconsciously a reference to something?
So I was quite interested. Near the end of the book, you actually reference Never Say Never Again, which some people erroneously label an unofficial Bond film. This is where it gets really nerdy, Lee, so just bear with me a second. So
I'm
Never
in.
Say Never Again is when Sean Connery came back in 1983, and it was produced by a guy who co-produced Thunderball and caused no end of legal issues for Eon, the main producing studio for Bond films. And then you call Sam's ex Kevin, and I was almost like, is this a reference to Kevin McClory? But that was my Bond brain on overdrive there.
I mean, it would have been really neat if I could say yes, but no, it wasn't. But I love that the universe conspired to make that happen. So,
Yeah,
yay.
just go with it. We'll just pretend it was intentional all along. The
We'll
thing
go with it. That sounds great.
the thing that I was hoping would happen as the book goes on, which did happen, is that, and again, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, particularly for adult readers, because I hope that most Bond fans have a quite realistic impression of James Bond as a role model. Is that Bond, although he's a role model in some ways, some of the stoicism and all the rest of it, he's actually not a great role model in lots of ways. And Sam realizes the limitations of Bond as a role model as well. Is that something you felt personally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like, I think I have a spirit of adventure, but like
Mm.
the body of a librarian, right? Like, I'm not exactly going to like, you know, do these crazy stunts that I have Sam and, well, particularly Nico do. But I love them, and I'm as active as
Mm.
I'm able to be. But yeah, I think that, even that thing that we, as a guy growing up in Western culture, right? Like, oh, real men don't cry. Like
Mm.
that, what? That's if if you don't have emotions, if you don't express emotions, what kind of relationships are you going to have?
Hmm.
They're going to
Hmm.
be really terrible because, and frankly, Bond does not have great relationships.
Nope.
And part of that is because he's so closed off. He's so
Hmm.
unwilling to be authentic
Hmm.
and be emotional. And, he's just about the mission. And yeah, the mission is saving the world. And maybe that's a trade off he's willing to make. But like,
Hmm.
I want to prioritize the relationships in my
Hmm.
life. So
Hmm.
I don't really want to be an action hero. And in fact, that's one of the fun things I got to play with is that in some ways, Nico is living this life of adventure and action. And I think that Sam would be inclined to kind of like idolize that. And that's one of the issues they have in their early when they have their meet cute. And is that, Sam just projects this idea of like, I've met a real life James Bond, and isn't that incredible and how fun? But actually, Nico's life sucks. He's on the run.
Hmm.
He's living under an alias. He has people chasing him and
Hmm.
trying to cheat him, and like, it is not great. So I feel like that's kind of fun for the reader to experience too. Like, oh, this fabulous life adventure kind of is shitty, and maybe I shouldn't aspire to that for myself, right? And I feel like I had to kind of do some growing up too when I was a teen about like, well, what kind of adult would I want to be? And you know, I, I didn't go into the spy service, but I actually that was funny. I was laughing about when I was writing the bio for this book.
Hmm.
I was like, I think it said something like Lee Wind is not currently a spy, but he did spend 14 years undercover, uh, what most people call in the closet. And I feel like that did really set me up for this sort of like affinity for Bond because, yeah, I was totally acting. I was dating girls. I was lying about what I felt and what I thought, for a long time, from 11 to 25. So in some way, I feel like maybe that's part of that magic. I know like you have this thing about like, what is the fascination that queer people have with Bond? Like maybe that's part of it. Like
Hmm.
we were all sort of spies in our own
Hmm.
bodies and, leading this double life kind of thing before we came out, because the presumption, of course, is that you're going to be like everybody else. You're going to, the sort of like heterosexual
Hmm.
um, uh, fantasy that, oh, everybody's like this. And then we have to sort of say, wait a minute, no, actually,
Hmm.
we're not wired that way. And that's kind of there's something there. There's something about that sort of secret spy thing. And even the name, I mean, like how the Bond, you know, asserts his name and, in that famous sort of patter, right? Like Bond, James Bond. When I met my husband 27 years ago, he had this funny habit of like when you go into like a coffee place and they ask for your name, he would use a different name every time.
Hmm. Hmm.
And and I would never use a different name. Like it took me so long to kind of like love myself enough to be like proud of
Hmm.
me and proud of my name. So I like actually have a bit of an issue. Like I can't like I just want to use my name. Like I
Can't
finally
hide.
came around to it.
Hmm.
And then so that was really fun too to play around with this idea of aliases. And they both Sam and Nico have a bunch of aliases that happen in the book. And when they have their meet cute, they actually are both under an alias. And that was really fun because then you're kind of screwed. Like this
Hmm.
person that you like doesn't know even your real name. And so I thought that that was really fun to play with.
It's definitely something because, as you know, on my website, I don't just have my perspective, but I've got a perspective of 20 plus people, have written articles, or probably more like 40, 50 plus now, people on podcasts and that sort of thing. And it is a commonality across queer Bond fans. They could relate to that feeling of being undercover. Actually, I'm happen to be friends with no spies as far as I'm aware, but quite a few people who were in the armed forces, including when it was actually illegal for them to be out in the armed forces. And they said they were so good at their jobs because, like an ace fighter pilot in the RAF. And she said that, she was so good at her job because she was transgender in the RAF, where she wasn't able to be her true self, but she was so good at hiding, flying as well as in her personal life, So there's definitely something there. For me it was 20 years. Not that it's a competition at all. Yeah, I think I knew I was gay from about 6 or 7, and then it was about 26. So about the same time that you came out as well. But like you, I've who knows, that might have been shortcutted if this book had existed, and if, it's funny what you've just said, and relating this story to people's real life experiences. I heard on another podcast you were on, and I thought, when I heard it, I thought, I've got to write this down and ask Lee a bit more about this, because I thought this is so interesting. You said when you write fiction, so much of your own truth comes out. So is that definitely something is that something you're very conscious of while you're writing, or is it you look back at the book later and you think, oh, hang on a second, so much of this is me?
I think for me, plot comes really easily when I'm writing. Like, I love getting characters into like really difficult situations and then figuring out how the hell are they going to get out of it. And so that flows very easily. To make a character feel real, though, that's where I feel like I put in the work as an author. And it takes a lot to make a character feel three-dimensional and real. And I think the only way I know how to do it is by kind of stepping into the shoes of that character and making it really specific to things that I know from my life. So it's kind of fun. People that know me can, like, tag the different moments and be like, oh, that was that from this. Like, I have my kiddo is in just turned 21, and she finished the book, and there's a joke towards the end of the book about how champagne doesn't taste as good as the character thought it would. And she was like, I love that moment. I'm like, that's totally an homage to you. Because it's something I've heard you say.
Being as I wasn't going to bring this up, but it was one of my favorite parts of the book, and it is right at the end. But it says, wait till you find out what a vodka martini tastes like." It's like, yeah, most teens are not going to enjoy a vodka martini. Are they really?
No. I mean, it's definitely an acquired taste, one that I still have not acquired, actually. So I feel like there's this idea about writing fiction in particular that you want it to relate to everybody. You have to make your character absolutely pablum, like no specific things at all, because if you say something specific and it doesn't relate to the reader, then that reader is going to be pulled out of it, and they'll be like, oh, well, I'm not left-handed, so this book doesn't apply to me. It turns out magically, I don't know how it works, but like, the more specific you are in writing fiction, the more you make it feel like a real moment. That's when you suck somebody in, right? Like, that's when they start to feel like, yes, I know this person's left-handed and I'm right-handed, but like, I felt that same way about, in your life. I mean, there's this cool thing, and I think I put it in the acknowledgments. When you write a manuscript, when I write the manuscript, it is mine, and then I work with a publisher, and it becomes ours. But then it goes to the reader, and it is theirs. It like the experience you had reading this book is different than the experience of everyone else that's going to read this book, slightly, right? Because you're bringing yourself to it. You're populating the cast of characters with your experiences and the people that you've met in your life. And I feel like the more I can bring in real moments from my emotions and my experiences, it makes it feel real to you. And I think that's why, like, it's sort of unexpected, but like, there is so much of me in this book, like, but it's not, I didn't want to footnote it or do endnotes. It's not nonfiction. I just want it to feel real. So I'm always taking notes about, like, when I go to places in the world. Like, I've never been to Machu Picchu. I ran it by a couple of people that had, but I'm like I scoured, I watched videos of visits, and I read, voraciously until I could make it feel real. And I remember that um, I was in Israel visiting the Dead Sea, and we were sitting somewhere, and then this camel sort of like walked by, and it was like this this nose full of camel smell. And it was just so like disconcerting because I was in this very mellow place and just sort of like having a sense of the vista ahead. And then it was suddenly interrupted by this like camel. And so I did this same kind of thing, but made it a llama because, Machu Picchu, Peru. So I feel like those kinds of moments where I can kind of like sit in the skin of the character um, makes the book work. I don't know how other people do it, but that's how I kind of do.
Yeah, totally. While you mentioned Peru, I was actually supposed to be going to Peru in 2 weeks' time. Unfortunately, I've had to pull out due to so many work commitments. I just can't fathom making that trip happen. So I'm sending someone in my stead. So when it did get to the Machu Picchu sequence, I was like, I really want to go there. It felt really authentic to me. I will get there one day. I will. I will. I will. I will. But I don't want anyone to get a misconception that this book is kind of really heavy going. As you said, you didn't want to traumatize the audience. You've got every Bond ingredient going. You've even got the alcoholic drinks at the end, even if they don't enjoy them. Teenagers drink alcohol as well. Probably less than they did when at the time that I was a teenager. Fortunately, I think they appear to have grown up a little bit more than my generation. But they drink alcohol. They travel to all these foreign locations. They use all these vehicles. It is a very Bondian story. You've even got some characters that, and again, maybe this is something you're going to explore in the next book, which I know you've already started planning, or maybe it's just me again, kind of projecting my Bond obsession onto this. But you've got a character in here who's basically fancies Sam, a genderqueer character. And I was sort of getting a bit of Miss Moneypenny dynamic between her and Sam because they're always not her, sorry, between them and Sam. So they're always pining for Sam, whereas we know Sam is not going to reciprocate. Is that something you did consciously, or is that just the bondiness filtering in?
I think there's more that's going to happen on that
Okay.
storyline in
Okay.
book two. But yes, I'm very aware of Moneypenny pining for Bond. And yeah, Ari is a great character. I think they would describe themselves as gender fabulous.
Mm,
And and I really wanted to populate their friend group with more of our queer community. So
mm,
that became really important to me. And yeah, like things, people don't start when the book starts, right? Like they have their lives, and I
mhm,
feel like that's when a story feels exciting and engaging. Like you are in the middle of it when you're entering, because you're coming in at a point where they're not babies, right?
mm,
They are
mm,
young adults, and they are figuring shit out, and it is exciting to jump in with them and try to make sure that you're not lost, but you're going along with them on
mm.
this adventure and on this journey. And um yeah, I mean, the unrequited crushes are hard, so I think they have a place, at least in the universe of this story.
I thought it was great that we didn't just have two gay, because a lot of young adult fiction is about two gay guys. It's always something I'm at pains to make sure that whenever I do lots of conference speeches and things about being inclusive in education and written articles, and I'm always at pains to point out when someone publishes one of my articles, I'm just like, can we not get two white gay guys in the image, please? Can we get, there's a lot more to the queer
Yeah,
community than this. And it's not woke or whatever nonsense you want to say. It's just representative of what queer communities are like. So I felt very much so that you created like Bond with his MI6 colleagues, essentially, which has become increasingly diverse as well, reflecting the reality of modern life. I thought that was definitely something I really appreciated.
thank you. Yeah, it's really important to me as as a gay man, I'm the G of the LGBTQIA2 plus community,
Mm,
and I really want to be an ally and
mm,
to help and uplift and
mm,
amplify their voices of the other communities in
mm,
our larger community. And also, but I think that it's beyond that. It's to women, it's to people of color,
yeah.
it's to indigenous people, it's to
Hmm.
disabled people. Like, I feel like that's sort of the magic starts to happen in terms of cultural change when we all sort of
Mm,
coalesce together and
mm,
create coalitions of people that are fighting against the injustice
mm,
against everyone. And it's interesting because our world is sort of in crisis, right? I feel like that's the news cycle, right? It's all about crisis and panic,
mhm,
and I kind of was not so nice to myself when I was working on this book because I just kept thinking, why are you writing this frivolous page turny adventure when you should be doing something important with the time
mm,
outside of your day job? And but I couldn't get it out of my mind. I was so
mm,
compelled by the idea and so drawn to it. And
mm,
what I discovered over the course of a few years of working on it was that centering two gay teens that fall in love and then have to save the world, or at least part of it, that actually did feel kind of
mm,
revolutionary.
mm,
Like, it did feel important because Lord knows I didn't have any books that centered anybody like me, that put anybody like me in the hero position, um, and made them feel real. Like that, it started to feel more and more like, okay, cool, this is worth it because we all need some escapism and some like great summer reads and
mm, mm,
page turning things, and to have ourselves represented, to have our community represented,
mm.
it means so much. So I kind of like changed my point of view on it, and I was like, there is something important to this. Maybe it's not important with like capital letters, but like it's important. It touches hearts, and I do think that like if we can get people to fall in love with Nico and Sam as they fall in love and they go off on their adventure, like I think that's how the world starts to change. I think it's one
Mhm,
book, one
mhm.
heart, and like I think it can snowball from there.
Yeah,
And
and this,
that
yeah, I think if you'd written something more didactic with a, heavy-handed message, I'm not sure that would have been as impactful. I mean, I can imagine not just queer teens reading this book, but their friends, family members. No spoilers, but it's a happy ending. And let's be honest, there's still a dearth of young adult fiction featuring queer characters that actually have genuinely. I mean, I cried. I'm not afraid to admit this, Lee. I'm a
oh,
crier anyway, but
good for
particularly,
you.
yeah, I did well up right at the end with sheer joy. And just the fact that I think it is still revolutionary. Sadly, sad to say, it is still really revolutionary for a queer narrative to have a happy ending, and we're getting
Right.
more
And
of them. But yeah,
I'm really upfront about the happy ending too. I'm like,
yeah,
it's a romance. It's
yeah,
going to
yeah,
have a happy ending.
yeah.
Because again, like, I think that that's one of the reasons romance is such a popular category is that
Mm,
people feel like, okay, it's safe for me to invest emotionally in wanting this to have a good
mm.
ending because I don't want to be dashed.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Like, so yes, it is absolutely a gay teen romance, action adventure. And I think that's really important to let people know. It's not so much that it's a spoiler alert. It's more like it is safe to fall in love with these two characters and to be rooting for them because it is going to all end well. Although there are twists and turns on the way.
Of course. So
And that queer joy that you're talking about, I'm sorry.
no,
I,
no, go for it.
I just wanted to say, like, that was the goal. Like, a lot of
Mm,
times people say, like, if you don't know how your book ends, you don't know what the point of it is. And I knew exactly how it ended because that reaction that you had, that sort of like queer joy,
mm,
that was exactly what I wanted to create. Like it's an empathy machine to create queer joy. It looks like a book,
mm,
and it reads like a book, but that was the goal, and that is actually where the whole idea for this crowdfunding Kickstarter
mm,
project happened.
mm, mm.
Um, if I can, I'll just share a little bit
Please do.
about it.
Yeah, I want as many people to get hold of this book as possible. I mean, just before you do, I had the same sort of feeling. Again, you mentioned Heartstopper, and I hadn't twigged this until you'd mentioned it. But when I watch or read Heartstopper, I get really emotional, and I think I get really emotional because I keep thinking, oh my God, if this had been around when I was this age, it would have helped with so much trauma. And I've spent thousands on, counseling and mental health interventions and all these things over the years, and worked my way through a lot of stuff. And I think I could have shortcutted a lot of that if I had had stories like this, which had queer joy at their center. So going back to what you say on the back of the book and what we started with, writing the kind of books that would have changed his life, I genuinely think this book can change lives, even young people reading it today, but also people of my age who have been out for 20 plus years, not even 20 years, am I? No, not even 20 years, but people who've been out for a while anyway and are still wrestling with stuff from their childhoods. And it can kind of make you see that it's not about regret and hoping things turn out differently, because hopefully things turned out all right in the end, but it's kind of saying the next generation probably going to be better, they're going to be all right. And I take a lot of solace in that, particularly because I work with so many young people, and I don't want any of them to go through the sort of thing that I went through. So I am really, really keen, and I know you're going to talk to us about this Kickstarter. I'm really keen as for as many people of whatever age, whatever queer identity, to get hold of this book as possible. So please go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, and that, I think there is a healing, right? There's a healing when you're reading it for your inner teen. That's sort of how I think about when adults read it. It's like you're reading it as a gift to the teen that you were.
Yeah.
And I know that I definitely have for all my books. So there's sort of like, there's the teens, the queer teens and their allies. They're of the same age. They're the adult allies, sort of like the teachers and the librarians and hopefully family members. And then there's the adults that are reading it for their inner teens.
Yeah.
And usually queer adults. And I think that that's amazing. And I'm so grateful for those readers too, because it was very healing for me to write it. So it's very joyful for me to hear that it was healing for you to read it. Yeah, and that idea of the book being this empowerment tool is where the idea for the crowdfunding came from. So my first novel, which I published back in 2018, was called Queer as a $5 Bill. And I didn't have a publisher. I crowdfunded it. And I went on Kickstarter and I explained about what I wanted to do. And I had 182 people back the project to make it a reality. And then I was able to hire editors and designers and kind of put up together a really professional book that ended up doing pretty well. This, A Different Kind of Brave, it's my second YA novel. I've had a couple of nonfiction books and picture books come out in the meantime, but now it's with a publisher, and they are only publishing it in paperback and as an ebook. So I was brainstorming with the Kickstarter is a big crowdfunding platform, and I was talking with Oriana Leckhart, who's the head of publishing at Kickstarter. She was at a conference that I was organizing, and we were talking about, like, she said, well, Kickstarter helps deliver your audience to you. And I was thinking about how, in 2018, when I did the first Kickstarter, I had that many people, help the project. But Kickstarter, you can't just say, like, and I worked with a nonprofit at that time. It was called Brave Trails. And the goal was to donate. I didn't want to make the crowdfunding thing about, like, help Lee publish Lee's book. It wasn't about me. It was like, that book was also sort of an empowering story for queer teens. So the goal was to, if you could donate, if you want a copy, you have to donate a copy. So we ended up donating a lot of copies. It ended up being really successful. We donated over 910 copies to queer teens, working with a nonprofit called Brave Trails. So I went back to Brave Trails and I said, hey, how many campers do you have this summer? And they have 350 campers this summer. And then I went to the publisher and I said, hey, you're only releasing the book as a paperback and an ebook. What if we did a special collector's edition hardcover that was only available through the Kickstarter? It's never going to be on sale in a bookstore. It's only available for 30 days on this Kickstarter as an incentive to get people to donate paperbacks to teens through this nonprofit. And they were like, sure, let's give it a try. Go for it. So I was able to hire the designer, and we put together this whole Kickstarter page. It's the day we're recording this, the Kickstarter has been live for 5 days. So there's 25 days left. And I'm just really excited because it's another way that the community can sort of like pitch in and help out. And I love the idea that it's for the community, it's for the younger kids in our queer community, but it's something that the larger community of allies and adults can participate in and can help. And I'm really hoping that it becomes a thing because, hey, I'd love to best, 910, but at the same time, doing the hardcover edition is so expensive, like all the
Mm,
bells and whistles, and
mm,
it's really cool. And I actually even talked with a printer in the UK, but it's so expensive to get the books from the UK to the US that it was like, that makes it too expensive. So it's a pretty audacious goal financially. It's like $13,275. We're about a quarter of a way there, 24% of the way there. But I wouldn't have done it if I didn't believe that we could pull it off
mm,
because with everything in the world happening right now, you kind of feel powerless. Like, well, how can I help? And
mm,
rather than being like, well, I can't fix it all, so I'm not going to do anything, like, here's like this one little small way that we can help. There's this beautiful quote I love. The author Anne Lamott, she writes she writes about writing as well as other things. And in her book, Bird by Bird, she talks about lighthouses. And she talks about how lighthouses don't run all over an island looking for boats to save. Lighthouses, they just stand there and they shine. And that is the working metaphor for me as an author. I think like every book is another light on in the lighthouse. And um, this idea of spreading more light in our world. And I think like every copy of A
mm,
Different Kind of Brave, if we can get these into the
mhm,
hands of those teens, that's another light on in the world. And then hopefully each of those teens will enjoy it and have that moment of queer joy and then talk about it and share it and post reviews online or get the word out and just tell their friends, ask their librarian to carry it in their school library.
mhm,
Like that's what I'm hoping for because I really my husband asked me, he's like, well, what's the point of you doing this? And I'm like, getting more books into the hands of more young
mm,
readers.
mm,
Like that's the bottom line.
mm.
It's not about anything else. Like for me, that's the goal, to spread more queer joy. And I'm just so grateful that I have this opportunity to do it. And thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you about it too, because it's a thrill to hear when a reader loves something that you worked so hard on for so many years. So
No,
thanks.
honestly, it was such a pleasure. And what I'll do is I'll make sure there is a link to the crowdfunding in the podcast notes, the YouTube notes. I'll put something on my website as well and on the social media, so as many people get you see that as possible. If people actually do want to get hold of this, because I believe my copy was actually shipped from the US, so thank you. I had these notifications that something was on the way. I can't even remember which part of the US it was from. I was like, what the heck is that? And then it eventually arrived, and I was like, oh, that's what it is. So if people in the US want to get hold of it, presumably it's really easy. What about the UK?
They should be able to. I mean, it is distributed through IPG, which
Okay.
definitely has distribution in the UK. So it
Mm-hmm.
should be available to be ordered from a local bookshop. I think you call them bookshops, right, rather than the
Mm-hmm.
bookstores.
But we call them
Uh,
bookstores too.
okay, and you can also order it online from wherever you like ordering books from. But yeah, it should be available. And also, there's an ebook version, so that is should be pretty easy to access.
Mm.
Through your UK systems are
Yeah,
and
we're not too kind of behind the times, Lee, but sometimes
no, it's all
the
good.
old
And
country sometimes
what's the
no,
joke? We're two countries separated by a common language.
yeah, pretty much. So pretty easy to get hold of. And internationally, because I know I've got a lot of people who follow License to Queer, a lot of contributors from around the world as well, who might want to get hold of an English language edition of this. They shouldn't have any issues either, should they?
I believe it should be available pretty much in English all around. But
Mm-hmm.
if they want to do the Kickstarter and get a hardcover special edition,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we can do international shipping. It's just one extra step.
Yeah, of
Kickstarter has this
course.
funny thing that if you apply international shipping, it actually counts towards your project goal, and you can actually end
Ah,
up not having enough money to do your project because you paid so
oh,
much for international shipping. So international shipping is one extra step that I have
okay,
to get your address, and we arrange it off the Kickstarter site. But
okay,
otherwise, yes, we can do it for anywhere. It's just a little bit more effort, but I'm happy to do that effort because
brilliant,
yeah, we are a global community, and that's what's so cool about this sort of technology.
absolutely. No, I'm so excited for more people to see this, to read this, obviously, and maybe comment on some of the posts that I'm going to put out about this as well, and hear what they think. I know so many people who follow what I do are, they're going to feel like I did about this book. It was like, this was written for me, or at least this was written for, 16, 17-year-old me. Most definitely. Yeah, I can't wait.
Perfect. That's what what I was hoping for when I wrote it, right? It's yeah, from 16-year-old me to 16-year-old you.
Oh, thank you.